Here's an interesting bit of trivia for you. Did you know that in the 1976 Indy 500, the car that crossed the finish line first didn't win? I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Hi there, Rick DeBrule up here at Desert Valley Auto Parts with a fun little chapter in the automotive evolution with this car right here, a 1976 Buick Century. So let's go back to that important question. How is it that the car that finished first in the 1976 Indy 500 didn't win? Well, that's because it was the pace car crossing the finish line ahead of all the cars. You see, it rained that year. They only completed 102 laps of the normal 200 laps that they would complete. Johnny Rutherford was the leader at that point, and it was the pace car that had to bring them across the line. They tried to start it a second time. It was still raining. Eventually they gave up and they called that race done after 102 laps. But it was the pace car that led everybody across the finish line in 1976. Now, this Buick pace car is a pretty interesting story when you look at the history of pace cars in the Indy 500. That's because Buick paced the Indy 500 a total of 6 times. They did their first time back in 1939, the second time in 1959, and in the mid-70s, they got to do it twice in a row, in 1975 and 1976, both times with the Centuries, but boy, those were very different cars. The 1975 Century had a 455 cubic inch engine underneath the hood. Now you would think, well, that's great power you'd get to power that field around the Indianapolis 500, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But you got to remember, this was the mid-70s. They didn't have a lot of performance, and that 455 wasn't delivering much in the way of power. In fact, it had a hard time getting up to speed. So when Buick was asked to come back the next year in 1976, it was under one condition. They had to have a car that was more capable of delivering the performance that they need to get the entire field up to speed, well, fast enough so that they could go racing. So they got rid of the big V8. They said, we're not going to do that. What they decided to put underneath the hood instead was a 3.8 liter V6. But what they did in 1976 was something interesting, and it was really a precursor, something we were going to see years later. They turbocharged that engine. In fact, they turbocharged it, did a number of things to make it a faster, better engine. As a result, instead of the anemic, 105 horsepower or so that a normal V6 was producing back in those days, the engine that they had in that pace car in 1976 was capable of 306 horsepower. It was 0 to 60 in 8 seconds. Now, 0 to 60 in 8 seconds may not sound like much today, but you have to remember, the year before, that 455, it was almost twice that. So getting that much performance out of this car was significant. In addition to the fact that they had that extra horsepower underneath the hood, they also lightened it significantly. The engine was lighter. I think it was a total of like 650 pounds lighter. So with that Ray J turbo, together with the fact that there was 650 pounds lighter, this edition of the Buick Century leading the 1976 Indy 500, well, it finally did a great job. But this one is special in a lot of different ways because of the graphics package. We're going to take a walk around and I want to show you because this is a pretty cool looking car, even if, well, it's on almost its last legs right now. So this is just one of the cars here at Desert Valley Auto Parts in a group of cars that for the most part are being sold because they're intact, well, mostly intact. As you can see, this one's had better days, but it is still there in terms of all the pieces. And what I love is the fact that the graphics on the side of this car, this Free Spirit package that was the Indy 500 pace car for 1976, well, they still show up in mostly glorious colors. There you see the Free Spirit name right there. And it's interesting looking at some of the pieces that they had on this. For example, we had the T-tops. This also is supposed to have a kind of a chrome strip that's going to go down and go across what was the window. But you'll notice the window was never taken out. It's still intact. But if you look inside, let's go inside, and we can see that it's got this panel that covers that up. They've done that in a number of other cars because basically some cars, they wanted to use that window, but in this car, this particular pace car edition, oh, and as I look inside, I can see that that little metal strip that goes over the top is still inside the car. Potentially could be put back in shape, but you can see how it would go right across here. You can see the stripe right there go down to here. A lot of surface rust here, but nothing too bad. Look at the spoiler in the back, and if you ever had any doubts about what it was made of, just take a look. It's already delaminating. You can see the fiberglass starting to come off it. But I like the way they put it all together. Here, it's got that Free Buick logo right there. Oh, it's even got the name of the dealer. Looks like it was bought out of Houston, Texas initially. Even has some little striping right there, which is pretty cool. So this whole graphics package was really cool. Now you have to remember, they didn't have a lot of performance back in the 1970s. If you didn't have performance, well, you had to go with something more, and that was style. That's exactly what they did. Now remember, I pointed out in the back that that spoiler, which was made out of fiberglass. Look up front, and you can see that this entire front section of the car is also made of fiberglass. By the way, in 1975, they legalized square or rectangular headlights. So 1976, that's exactly what they have on this 1976 Buick Century. Of course, you'll notice this massive bumper that comes out because that was exactly what they needed back in those days. Now, underneath the hood in this car, it does not have that V6 engine. This has a 350 engine. It's got the J-code engine, I believe. So it's a 350. And while, yes, Chevrolet and Buick had similar 350s, they were different. And as a result, they weren't quite the same. This engine, I think this small block version of this came out in the early 60s and went on for quite some time. But this is not the same as a Chevy 350. This is a Buick 350 engine here. But like I said, what is missing is the fact that it does not have that turbocharged V6 engine. That's because when they made the Pace Car editions, they initially thought they were going to be able to offer that potentially as an option to people who bought the Pace Car edition, but they weren't able to do that. As a result, if you were going to be buying one of those Pace Car editions with the V6 engine, it was going to be pretty anemic, just over 100 horsepower. Most people wanted more. As a result, I think it's got 145 horsepower with a 2-barrel, and it got 165 horsepower with the 4-barrel carburetor attached to it. Nothing impressive in what you think about today, but a lot better than that anemic V6. Now, what's really interesting about that V6 is ultimately, while it didn't see much duty in terms of going into production that year, years later, that's exactly what they did. Yeah, instead of the V8, remember in the Grand National, that same 3.8 liter engine, that's what they put into the Grand National with the turbocharger. And as a result, they were able to create a pretty interesting line of cars in the 1980s, the Grand Nationals, the GNX, all thanks to that idea that came out of this car, the Pace Car edition, in 1976. All right, let's take a look inside. Oh, door opens actually pretty decently. As I look at the frame, it looks pretty good. Still has its little codes right there. Not a trim tag, but all things considered, not bad. It's got a cool centered console right here. Notice how it's an automatic and it slides back and forth, but notice how it kind of tapers as it goes forward. Up above, we've got an AM/FM radio, all the great gauges. Can't really see through very much. It's all kind of clouded up right now, like the big Buick right there. It looks like very comfortable seats, and it's actually got a decent back seat, because remember, this was a Buick Century. As I look around in here, see what else we can see. There's the air cleaner sitting right there. And once again, it looks like it's seen better days, but the nice thing about this particular car is it does look like it's completely intact. In fact, there is the trim section for that chrome piece, or that bright metal piece that goes across the top, the stainless chunk. As I look across, once again, it's typical Arizona, a lot of surface rust, but nothing too horrible. I do see on the hood, it looks like somebody had a bit of a problem, did some body work, and you can see how it's kind of chunking up, did a little bit of Bondo work. Not quite sure what the story was of that. I don't think it burned. Well, you can see it kind of burned in the sun, but I don't think it had an actual fire as such. Once again, all part of this free spirit package on this 1976 Buick. By the way, if you're thinking restoring the car is the easy part, getting the graphics, now that's complicated. Well, look what I found on a website called Stencils and Stripes, a full graphic kit for a 1976 Buick Free Spirit Pace Car Edition. Now, it'll cost you almost $1,800, but it's nice to know that if you want to restore this, well, the original looking graphics are still available. All right, the tires are flat, so it's pretty hard to get underneath, but as you can see, all the pieces seem to be pretty intact, no major rust. While it may have been sold in Houston, I'm going to say, especially looking at these body panels down here, that I think it lived most of its life probably in Arizona. I see it's got an Arizona license plate. Let's look in the back and see if we can see very much rust underneath. No, actually, for a 1976 car, I know all you people back east would be very excited to see this thing. Well, this 1976 Buick Century Pace Car edition didn't have the kind of performance everybody would have hoped for if they were watching that pace car actually running around during the Indy 500. It really did lay the foundation for one of the most iconic cars of the 1980s. The Grand National, of course, the GNX as well, using that 3.8-liter engine, that V6, and putting a turbocharger on it. This car, at least the Pace Car edition, showed what was capable with that package and probably inspired those folks a little bit later to come up with something a little bit more. Now, once again, this car has the 350 engine in it, and if it were me, if I were restoring this car, you know what I'd do? I'd take out that 350 and I'd put in a 3.8-liter, but I'd put in one with a turbocharger. I'd make it just exactly the way it was when it was pacing the Indy 500. So you could show the kind of potential that they were looking for in 1976, that they'd actually achieve with that pace car edition that led the way for Johnny Rutherford to cross the finish line in 1976 and win the Indy 500 after only 102 laps. But once again, this is a 1976 version, so it didn't have any spectacular horsepower. What it had was show. It had that great graphics package. And the great thing about this one up here at Desert Valley Auto Parts, yes, surface rust, but as we looked underneath, didn't see a lot of major rust. The engine mostly intact. A lot of work required to put this back together, but this car has so much potential to show just exactly what kind of Buick potential there was back in the 1970s.